Today's session is All Systems Down, our June installment of the Cyber Series. Joined with me today, as I mentioned before, is my esteemed colleagues, Daniel Moko, our Head of Cyber Security Services.
Good morning.
And Tim Archer, our Head of Communications, Crisis Communications.
Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen.
It would not be a webinar of something wrong, would it?
Well, I'm just hoping we haven't been hacked. That's the main thing in this situation. Thank you very much for joining us and bearing with us. Appreciate that we've had a bumpy start. Just to talk you through today's session, what we'll be doing is walking through some pretty juicy case studies, talking through some situations where it has very much been an all systems down and system outage for a lot of major organisations, global organisations around the world. Talking through some common trends and blind spots that we're seeing, both out of those case studies and things that we're seeing on the ground live. Talk through some communication and contingency strategies and things to think about going into a little bit solution mode. Obviously talking through some critical success factors and takeaways that we might be able to take back to the office. Question and answers, we have left about 15 minutes at the end of this session for question and answers. We really value your input into this and appreciate your start to that in terms of giving us the heads up in the audio. But if you can, during that process of the webinar, essentially just click on the panel, put in your questions in the Q&A tab. We'll get to as many of those as we can possibly get to at the end of the session. We do typically go through this as a live stream, but given our technical difficulties this morning, we're going to press forward. You can see our smiling faces there. We are here in spirit and in person, just obviously behind the scenes. We might kick off. Daniel.
Marcus, thank you.
Good morning. What do you got for me?
Oh, we've got a lot, quite a buffet today, so we'll dive on in. I wanted to say, first of all, welcome back to those of you who've come back and joined us from our previous cyber series where we spoke about APRA's CPS 234. So if you're new though, welcome. We'll dive right into one of these case studies. So guys, we're going to cast our minds back to 2012, some 7 years ago. And I always like when I'm talking about these case studies to put you in the technical, I guess, mind frame of the era. So in 2012, we saw the release of the Samsung Galaxy S3, the iPhone 5 at that stage, and Microsoft debuted its Surface tablets. I'm not sure if anyone here on the panel had one of those devices. I certainly had a Samsung.
7 years is a long time in technology, isn't
it? I still have it somewhere flying around one of my bottom drawers. But look, it was 2012, and we're going to speak about a major cyber hack that happened at Saudi Aramco. So for those of you that don't know this company, Saudi Aramco is one of the largest companies in the world. They obviously produce oil and gas, mainly out of Saudi Arabia. They're a state-owned company, and they were the victims of, from my perspective, a catastrophic cyber breach. So let's talk a little bit about what that looked like. They were targeted with a piece of malware called Shamoon. It was, in the end, a piece of malware that targeted 35,000 of their individual computers. So this was a piece of malware. We think that the attack vector or the way into the system was through someone in the IT services department clicking on a phishing email. And as a result, in about the middle of August 2012, Saudi Aramco saw all their computers start to become infected with a particularly vicious piece of malware. Now, I guess what differed from this piece of malware from ones that we've seen in the past was this piece of malware wasn't designed to extort a ransom or to capture some data or to exfiltrate something from inside the systems. It was designed purely to destroy, and it was very effective at that. We saw about 35,000, as I mentioned earlier, of 50,000 computers that Saudi Aramco had around the world. And what it caused for them was they were completely unprepared for a cyber incident of the scale, not the velocity this was happening at as well. There's some really fantastic stories that come out as part of this. And I think you can see on screen there's a couple of photos and whatnot. So what you have down there in the left-hand side is an extract from Pastebin, or think of it as a Reddit or a GitHub style depository, and that was from a group called the Cutting Sword of Justice, who were apparently the cyber actors in this case. And what you had there on the right is a photo of a lot of oil tankers that couldn't be filled up with gas because they couldn't be paid. So Saudi Aramco had invested a lot of money in protecting their industrial control systems, in protecting their automated systems. And what they hadn't done was apply a similar level of protection or investment into the cybersecurity of their corporate networks. And what you saw from these guys is suddenly, nearly overnight, catapulted back into using typewriters, into using manual workarounds, into dusting off the fax machines. And that had a big impact on the company, and it still does to this day in their cybersecurity posture. So for me, the sheer scale of this one is something that I find immediately sort of sticks out to me. And just indulge me, gentlemen, there's a fascinating story that came out a couple of years later in the incident response. So these guys, and given that, one of the largest companies in the world, they were able to bring on a huge incident response team. And these guys needed new hard drives for their computers, and they needed them quickly. So they mobilized their fleet of private planes, Saudi Aramco, and they flew incident responders to some of the hard drive manufacturers in Southeast Asia, and they stood at the front of the queue to get new hard drives as they came off the production line, which is, I think, just fascinating to show you the amount of resources that this company put into getting back online, quickly. So, I mean, the upshot was, if you bought a new computer or a new hard drive somewhere in the vicinity of September 2012 to January 2013, you probably paid a slightly inflated price, and you can thank Shamoon and Saudi Aramco for that. So a lot of lessons to unpack for this one. And I think, as I said, this is the first successful attack that pitched away from that ransom money data to pure destruction. So that's Saudi Aramco.
We're looking at a big, long line of trucks there. Is that, I'm assuming that's their operations knocked out in terms of pumping fuel?
Correct. So the fuel and the automated systems, so they still managed to get the oil out of the ground, but what they didn't have was any way to pay the drivers for the transport. So all the oil was just sitting there, and you had a lot of trucks lined up trying to take the oil away. I mean, this is a company that's producing somewhere in the vicinity of 10 million barrels of oil a day. So what you saw there was also the potential for this hack to impact global oil prices and global oil supply at the same time.
Right. And it's interesting you say they reverted to typewriters and fax machines for their communication. I guess the more you automate your systems, the more you have to have really good backup communication systems in place for that internal communication.
Absolutely. And, going back to the days of typewriters and faxes, you can imagine the impact that would have on a modern business and the way that we all do business now.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're only talking 7 years ago that the Maersk shipping hack, which was just last year, I think they talked about reverting to fax machines even then. So that they said fax machines were still a godsend just quite recently. So
I honestly wouldn't know where to find a fax machine.
No,
right.
Yeah,
If you
be able to use it anymore, to be honest.
yeah. Not that I'm recommending faxes, but backup systems need to be in place for communication.
Great. So we might move on to another example of what I think is an absolutely fascinating case study. And this is a French TV network called TV5 Monde or TV5 Global. So what happened to these guys is on April 8th, 2015, at about 8:40 p.m., a lot of the station's management had been out celebrating. They just launched a brand new station, and luckily, for what comes later, a lot of the technical staff was still there. We're making sure that the new station was running correctly. But at about 8:40 p.m., the CEO of TV5 Le Monde, I think he was actually out at the time having dinner with a colleague from Canadian radio. His phone started to blow up with messages and phone calls, and all 12 channels of TV5 went off the air at that time. And there's the photo you can see there is I think a very poignant shot from the reception of this TV station, where you can see most, if not all, of the station has gone down. And then to your right there as well, at the same time, the station's Facebook, Twitter, and web page was also affected. So once again, this was claimed by a group of actors who called themselves the Cyber Caliphate. And if you think about the context of the time that was happening in French, you had the Charlie Hebdo terrorist attacks. There was a lot of things happening in that sphere at the time. And I think they created a lot of nervousness, particularly when you saw pictures like you do there to the right. As far as the scope and scale of the attack, what you see here is fascinating. And what sticks out for me in this case study in particular is the amount of reconnaissance and forethought that these cyber actors put into this attack is frankly mind-boggling. So the cyber actors who infected the network took their time. They were in there and they learned how TV5 Mod broadcasted signals, and they developed bespoke tailored malware that was then able to target things like the encoders that had been connected to the internet by these guys. So this bespoke malware targeted the encoders that were used to transmit TV stations, and they were the subject of the attack, which was so effective. The first station managed to get back online at 5:25 a.m. the next morning, and subsequently a few hours you saw the rest of the TV stations start to come online. But
so we're talking about 10 hours of black screens, and having worked in television, like 10 seconds of black screen is worthy of panic, and 10 hours is disastrous.
It definitely took these guys off the air permanently. This attack is just absolutely fascinating, and I think it's worthy of note here. There was a lot of vectors, or to use less techie terms, there was a lot of ways into the TV5 Mod network, and one of them was outside of France, was outside of the network entirely. It was a Danish manufacturer of studio cameras that TV5 Mod had been using remotely to control some studios, and they served as a point of no way to deliver this successful attack. So you can see there absolutely like a lot of planning involved. And when we get to attribution or who is responsible, there's a lot of conjecture and talk that was it Cyber Caliphate, was it the Russians? I guess as well as the earlier reconnaissance point that I made out, the other question here is about, well, why TV5 Mod? Why attack a French TV station like this, which is such a sophisticated and sustained attack? And I guess that's one of the questions that we still don't know to this day. And there's been a lot of investigation and analysis, and you can imagine a lot of attention and effort from the French government and French authorities about how a piece of, let's face it, what is communications critical infrastructure could be so blatantly and publicly attacked.
Yeah, and I guess, again, from the communications perspective, if you're going to be cyber attacked and have to communicate to your audience, there's no better place to be than own your own TV network. Having said that, when there were so many unknowns, it's very hard to communicate what you don't know, and that's part of any cyber response, communicating what you do know, communicating what you don't know, and it sounds like there was such big question marks over that. Hats off to their managing director, who after the event has been very proactive in sharing the lessons learned in that space, and puts his hand up and says he wasn't prepared enough, or the network wasn't prepared enough. And you're right, Tim, he's been very open and honest about the extent and scale of the hack. And so for these guys, the mop-up's still continuing. You're seeing millions of euros of cost to bring their systems up to speed. So they're investing in cybersecurity. But I guess one of the things that's resonated with me that the managing director said is that it's actually changed nearly every part of the way that these guys work. So they now take extra steps when they receive emails from outside of their internal network, because once again, one of the attack vectors in this case was a phishing email that someone actioned and clicked. So he said, for a media company or for a dynamic TV studio, they've had to pare back some of those processes and really think about how they interact with their people and how they can get the most from their cybersecurity investment, so that this catastrophic attack for these guys certainly doesn't happen again.
I think the scary thing in that, it only takes one phishing email. Like, that's a massive increase in cost to cybersecurity, and it comes down to a human factor there again. Next time around, that's going to be a really interesting, approach to market from a messaging point of view.
Yeah, and you can communicate to your internal staff till the cows come home about cybersecurity awareness and not clicking on phishing links, but it only takes that one, just that one person to not get the message, or not see through what's a malicious email.
And just very briefly on this one, Jennifer, because it is so fascinating. Tim, when you are a communications company like a TV station, when you can't broadcast on the air, your Twitter, your Facebook, and your websites to face, where do you go? I mean, where do you even start when it's such a catastrophic hack?
Absolutely. Well, it comes down to having backup systems, backup communication channels there ready to go.
So the next one, guys, that we're going to focus on is something a bit more topical. It's something that's been certainly making the rounds around the moment. And if we have time, I'd also love to touch on the events and things that are happening in the city of Baltimore at the moment, in Maryland in the US, because once again, some more fascinating stuff for us to dissect and to dive into there. What we are looking at the moment, guys, is Norsk Hydro. So Norsk Hydro, they're a very large aluminium manufacturer, smelter, based out of Norway, but obviously operate globally, as most of these large manufacturing and smelting companies do. They were infected with a particular strain of ransomware called Lockagoga. What happened there, and what you can see there, is from very early on in the attack on your screens at the moment. And if a picture says 1,000 words, well, then this is certainly a War and Peace novel there, right there, isn't it? I mean, the very symbolism of having that pasted to your front door about absolutely not connecting to the network shows you the initial levels of confusion and chaos and the need to have other ways of getting key messages out there to staff and customers. I mean, I'll talk a little bit about the specific areas that I think have been impacted by this particular set of ransomware, because Norsk Hydro, I think, have been pretty good overall in their comms response to this particular hack. And what you are seeing, though, is a sustained cost to these guys as they move forward. So this only happened in once again, early on March, April this year.
Yeah. It's
still happening. It mainly affected two production areas. So it was the extruded solutions part of Hydro Norsk, which produce really refined metals for customers like Tesla and VW, and absolutely you cannot switch to a manual process there because you need the oversight and the precision that comes from having a computer-aided production and whatnot. And the other one was the building systems unit. So they produce the aluminium frames for doors and windows and whatnot. And I think a couple of those units around the world are still coming back up online for these guys. And the initial sort of finger in the air estimate of how much it's going to cost them initially is about $50 million US at the moment. So a huge impact on them. And that's not accounting for any brand or reputational damage there either. So that's purely just the cost to get the systems back online. And what these guys are doing is they're not paying the ransom. They're actually going back to backups or trunking entire systems and starting again.
I think the scary thing about this, and just looking at that photo, that scares me, number one, but number two, like they have thousands of staff in multiple locations.
Yep.
Like this is a global organized. It's one of the biggest aluminium producers in the world. Like you can imagine the disarray walking in as an employee and seeing that on the front door as you walk in.
Yeah, and look, from what I've read about it, it's all that internal communications. That sign on the door is internal comms. Way back in the dark ages, pre-computers, you post a notice on the door and people were running around actually telling people, do not open your computer. I read a story just this morning about a bloke who got contacted at home. He'd been working from home. He just got told, just rip the cords out of the back of your computer. And he jumped out of bed and he did. And like that internal comms, so critical in the situation. But if you don't have the platforms to do that are offline or independent of your network, then that's very, very hard to do, especially when you're talking thousands of people.
Just imagine some of the optics, though. I mean, of this. If your clients are walking into the lobby and you see these signs plastered over your front door, they're going to have to start to wonder about maybe looking around and going somewhere else.
Well, it's not just the person walking in the lobby, it's the person who walks in the lobby and takes that photograph and puts it on social media. Yeah, that's right. And so millions of people can see it.
So we've got a few pretty grim case studies there. We've got more that if we get time, we might jump into.
We're always happy to talk about them, Marcus.
What are we saying? I mean, what are the trend underlying factors there, and what are we seeing when we're talking with clients around cyber?
Yeah, and I guess in this context, we talked a lot of our client base about cyber. We always exercise for a broad range of threats and cyber scenarios, including catastrophic scenarios, because you need to be prepared for the worst to happen. But I guess the thing that I hear consistently is this can't happen to me. I've got protections in place. I don't run that type of network. I use a different type of software. And you would probably have heard a very similar line from people like TV5 Mod or even Norsk Hydro. Like, why would they be a target in the grand scheme of the grand cyber game that's being played at the moment? So I think a really important mindset shift that needs to happen for people is anything is possible if you're connected to the internet. And there's fantastic benefits for business when it comes to connectivity and the digital revolution that we're seeing. But there's also this other side, and you need to acknowledge this other side. And you can't come from a place of saying this can't or won't or shouldn't happen to me, because it absolutely can. And we've just touched on 3 big examples today, but there's so many more we could have spoken about.
And happening more regularly, of course.
I guess the other thing that strikes me out, an element of all 3 of the cases that we've discussed today, and we touched on this earlier, at some point, somewhere along the line, someone got an email and they clicked on something they shouldn't have. Now, this isn't certainly to point a finger or to blame anyone for that type of behaviour, because if you look at the way that we communicate now, and if you look at the way that we all operate, it's very easy for us to dismiss emails, read emails. I mean, it's become a regular part of our day. It's become part of our DNA. So I guess the human behaviour is still one of the weakest links that we see here, and it will continue to be. And there's a range of statistics out there, but anywhere from about 75 to 90% of current successful malware attacks still start with an email. So they still start with a phishing link. I guess in all of this as well, I mean, the other thing that becomes apparent is, and it's related to the first point there, but people assume they have an IT team and that their IT team is able to handle any number of catastrophes or crises or systems going down. And the overall thing about cybersecurity, and you hear all of us who work in the profession say it all the time, there is a team sport and that it requires buy-in from everyone. So it's no longer okay to say, I've got an IT team, they'll handle this. Absolutely not. And when it comes to a large catastrophic breach, some of the things like you saw for instance, the Saudi Aramco breach, was that they had an IT team, but they certainly didn't have a cyber response team able to cope with the magnitude of the breach. So I think it's resting on laurels like that. It no longer speaks to being prepared, having your head on your heart and saying, I'm absolutely ready for this.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, Daniel, that I guess the communications team shouldn't sit there in isolation and think, okay, the IT team have this covered, it's their area of expertise, they're going to fix this, and they'll simply tell us when they're back online. The comms team and the IT security team need to be talking and collaborating very closely before something like this happens. So there's a really robust set of pre-approved key messages ready to go in the event of an all systems down scenario, and then also be really tightly collaborating with that IT team to provide updates and messages and regular updates to ensure people know that the information that you can see is the latest information. Even an update that says there's no update since our update 2 hours ago helps people know that they're getting the latest information.
It's so easy to lose control of a narrative in a cyber crisis, isn't it?
That's right. And I guess that fourth common blind spot's about communication channels not working anymore. And we've called this webinar All Systems Down, and that includes your communication channels. And it really comes down to comms teams and also IT teams knowing that if you turned off all your computers and all your laptops and disabled email on your phones and you just gave the comms team a mobile phone that could make and take phone calls, can they still communicate? Their CRM's down, they may not have access to all those databases, all those critical channels and stakeholder groups that they need to get to. The question is, can they communicate? And if they're not ready to do that, then they're simply not ready.
So moving into solution mode as opposed to problem mode.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it does come back to having those alternative communication channels there ready to go. And I know you touched really briefly on Baltimore. We don't have time to go into it, but in Baltimore, their systems went down. So they said, right, how are we going to communicate? Let's set up bulk Gmail addresses because their emails were disabled. And even Google picked that up and said, well, here's a bunch of people creating Gmail addresses, must be a bunch of spammers, and it actually blocked them from creating the addresses. Google then turned around and fixed that for them very quickly. But it goes to show that everything is really simple. Tasks are really difficult in this situation. So set up your alternative communication channels well and truly in advance. Yeah. Next point comes to messaging, and I'll put on the slide here quality and quantity. In the absence of information, people assume the worst, and if you only give people a really short and sweet, we're aware of this, we change your password and monitor your accounts. Well, okay, that's a great start, but if that's all you're giving them, newspapers need to fill their stories with content and information, and if you're giving them a little bit of information, they'll fill up the rest of that story with someone else's story. So the message there is give them good quality and quantity information as much as you possibly can.
Yep.
And thirdly, on this point, we talk about the victim versus culprit factor. So when you first get breached, just remember you are a victim. It's easy to put the blinkers on and think, gee, we're the culprit here and we need to apologise to all our customers and partners. Yes, you do. Of course you do. But also don't forget to play that victim card. It's got to be played subtly, sometimes less than subtly. Right up the front, some organisations go out with the fact that this has been reported to police. There's an investigation, whether it's the FBI, the Australian Federal Police are all over it. That's reminding the public that not only are all the customers and partners inconvenienced and had their maybe their data stolen, it's also the company that's under attack. But that only plays. You can only play that card for so long. If you can't then get back up on air and start communicating again and get your systems back up, that diminishes in its currency.
Well, and we're seeing that in Baltimore, aren't we?
Absolutely.
Like after being hacked 12 months ago, and it's round two, we've got a very frustrated city.
Yeah, they're 5 weeks in.
5 weeks in with having no way to do a lot of things. Like sell houses.
Yeah, if you just go onto the Baltimore City website, there's a big red box that says we can't receive or send out emails. I mean, the inability to do that is...
That's where that pendulum swings, doesn't it? From victim over to culprit there for the second time round in 12 months.
Absolutely.
I think one of the other things that we see a lot and we talk about a lot is obviously that link into operational impacts and understanding what are those critical functions that are also being impacted. I mean, we see this a lot when we're doing exercising and sometimes not taking the step back to consider all the areas of the business that are being hit and understanding what those impacts are and then thinking through the contingency strategies for that. So I think to your point earlier, it's not one team that's going to be responding to this. It's going to be multiple teams doing multiple things to get up and running.
And I mean, if you look at Saudi Aramco, for instance, yep, they could still get the oil out of the ground, but then they couldn't pay the truck drivers, so it wasn't going anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it comes back to the more automated you are, the more ready you have to be for those systems to go down.
Yeah. From a takeaway, critical success factors, guys. I mean, let's give something to take away home here. I mean,
guys, and I think if you take anything out of the 3 case studies today, is the scale, the pure scope and the speed of a cyber crisis can't be estimated. I mean, all of these companies, Norsk, TV5 Mon, Saudi Aramco, would never have thought in their wildest dreams that such a catastrophic breach would come their way, and yet here we all are years later. So I think it's really important that people keep that at the back of their mind, is that the scale and the velocity of a cyber crisis can absolutely hit you for 6. Absolutely. And I think we touched on it a little bit earlier, but the importance of having plans, cross-functional plans that touch all parts of your business, whether it be cyber incident response, whether it be IT disaster recovery, crisis comms, business continuity. These plans need to all speak to each other for a start. So they need to be cognizant of each other, and they need to be updated regularly, because the cyber threats and the context that we're facing, it's an evolving threat landscape, and we need to make sure that all of those plans are up to date and ready to roll at a moment's notice.
Yep.
I guess, what's the point of having a plan if it sits in the cupboard somewhere collecting dust? You've got to practice your plans. We recommend it at least twice a year when it comes to practicing and exercising plans, because people change, organisations change, and the ability to know those plans like the back of your hand, it happens like muscle memory in a real crisis. And
we know a lot do exercise those plans, but do you exercise them in a scenario where you don't have access to your systems or systems down? If you don't, it's worth giving it a shot.
Absolutely.
Scary. A little scary, a little daunting.
But better to do it in peacetime than in crisis time.
Absolutely.
And the last one we're talking about is having an independent cloud-based communications tool. So, like I say, having those offline channels available to you, ensuring that all your databases are backed up offsite or elsewhere, so that you can reach those people if your business as usual systems are down. And I can't but help mention CQ Command here. Obviously, a lot of clients know about this. I won't dwell on it, but that's a good example of an offline platform where all those databases can be loaded in there, regularly updated. And as we know, databases can be all over the place in an organisation. You might have your CRM, but then your media database is somewhere else, and customer data. So put them all in there, and even your internal staff list is critical in those.
I think the days of having a calling tree in your wallet that's laminated are well and truly over.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay. Favourite part of the webinar, we are moving into Q&A.
Yes.
Where people get to throw curly questions at the panel, and we'll get through as many as possible. Obviously, we're a little bit shorter on time than usual, given our technical difficulties at the commencement of the webinar. But please, if you've got any burning questions at the moment, we have the team here for the next 5 to 10 minutes. I'm happy to stay a couple of minutes extra if there's so much coming through. We do have a couple of questions coming through, which is not about our feedback, which is good. What's your view on cyber collateral damage, and how can companies protect themselves?
This is a great one, and I think we saw it, and you touched a little bit on this earlier, Tim, when you mentioned Mondelez, but then Maersk, and I want to mention in the same context Mondelez. So Mondelez are a Spanish food producer, and they were infected by NotPetya ransomware from about 2 years ago. And there's been some toing and froing with Mondelez's insurer over payment when it regards to the cost of bringing them back up to speed. So the Mondelez breach was quite significant. I mean, it stopped production at some of their factories. You're talking millions of euros of dollars of damage, and bringing the systems and the computers back up to a reasonable state has been costly for these guys as well. And they did have cyber insurance, but the whole NotPetya piece of ransomware really came about, and this is public knowledge out there now, of course, that it was the result of the Ukrainian-Russian situation, a piece of really targeted malware in that conflict, I guess you could say, for a better word. So these companies really became innocent victims of that whole conflict, and you cannot avoid being collateral damage in this sense now either. There's nowhere for you to go and run and hide. So, how can companies protect themselves is the second part of the question. Absolutely get the fundamentals right. Know your vulnerabilities, patching, fix the human situations, and have a robust cyber awareness program, and understand what your cybersecurity maturity looks like. That's some really easy ways to protect against becoming the next piece of collateral damage, because the way that the world's going, these type of events are only going to increase in their scope and frequency.
Okay. Tim, this might be one for you. Should our comms team have a separate cyber comms playbook over and above their normal crisis comms plan?
Good question. Look, my short answer is not necessarily. I think any comms team should have a good, robust crisis communications plan already. I'd feel And that should include all those tools and tactics and strategies to deal with a cyber event. So I wouldn't totally recommend duplicating a crisis comms plan just for cyber, but there really are some important specific steps that you need to put in place in advance to deal with these all systems down scenarios. So look, each to their own. You could do a separate one, but there is a degree of duplication there, I would have thought.
Okay. What key questions should IT security be asking the comms team to make sure that they're ready?
Well, it comes back to, can they communicate if they don't have computers, really? If you walk to your comms team now and say, if I took this computer away from you and this laptop and disconnected your phone from our network, can you communicate in a major crisis event? And if the comms team go, maybe, then the answer is probably no. So, it's all about getting those systems in place that we've talked about.
We might need to see some training on how to use faxes for millennials as well as a part of that, because I don't know if you put them in front of a fax machine, many of them will be able to use it properly.
Yeah, that's right. Indeed.
Okay. Let me just have a look here. What else do we have? Okay, so we've spoken about cyber crises in manufacturing, media and resource sectors. What other sectors are prone to cyber attacks?
So, equally my answer is going to be all sectors at all times, but what you're seeing is your particular concentration in those sectors where actors can get most bang for their buck. So they're making an investment in cyber tools and in cyber attacks, and they want to see a return on that investment, obviously. And so the other sectors that immediately come to mind, there are three target sectors here. One is the financial services industry, because there's a wealth of data there.
And money.
And money, thank you. That's all ones and zeros now. So that's an tempting and alluring target in of itself. I think the other one we're seeing a lot of concentrated attacks on at the moment is the public sector. And you're seeing it in places like Baltimore, and you're seeing it in those levels of government that may not be as well defended as, say, a large federal government. So they don't have the resources behind them to be completely up to date and have everything buttoned up. So they're a bit of low-hanging fruit when it comes to cyber attack. And like I always say, cyber criminals are like electricity. They'll find the path of least resistance. And the third one, guys, I think is really important. There's a huge push on at the moment in digitization of healthcare, everything from prescriptions through to IoT devices embedded in your body. A lot of investment in patient safety, not so much in the cybersecurity field. So once again, there's some really tempting low-hanging fruit in those industries.